Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault by R.A. Marmel. I'm BurningDogFace, and this time we're going to be checking out Chapter 9, where we catch up with War in the Silver City of Heaven. So, here we go. It happened so fast that neither the angelic sentinels circling above nor the soldiers on the street could do more than gape in utter astonishment. A fearsome cracking, not unlike the shattering of some great peak, echoed from down the street, followed by shocked and fearful cries, angels scattered in all directions, on foot and on the wing, hurling themselves clear of some sudden danger. Many were already recovering their wits, reaching for weapons but to little avail. Before the echoes of that crack had faded away from between the massive walls nearby, it was replaced and overwhelmed by what seemed at first to be the dull rumble of rolling thunder. The roadway shook, so that dust and bits of detritus sifted out over the edges, along with the occasional angel who hadn't yet taken to the air. From the chaos charged War and his terrible mount. The flaming hooves of the beast seared their mark into the paving stones, and it was those swift, inexorable strides that shook the street beneath. Ruin galloped unrestrained, for the horseman had no hand upon the reins. He held both high above his head, and with them he supported an inconceivable weight. The effigy of the lunging angel, larger than horse and rider combined, carved of solid stone, would have required 2 or 3 of the White City's mightiest to lift it off the ground, yet here it seemed scarcely even to slow the fearsome pair who carried it now. The first shots began to rain down as the angels circling above took aim with their halberds. Between Ruin's speed and the intervening obstacles, however, only a few got through, and those accomplished little more than to dig chips from the statue. Only 1 or 2 of the guards on the street had shaken off their astonishment enough to open fire, and these had no success in penetrating either War's armor or his mount's toughened hide. The building loomed before him, growing ever closer. War rose, standing in the stirrups. With a deep grunt, he snapped his body forward, hurling the sculpture with all his unnatural strength. The massive projectile soared ahead of them to slam with devastating force, not against the door, but against the stone wall some few paces to the right of the entryway. The statue shattered into heavy chunks that bounced and skittered along the roadway. The wall itself was shot through the cobweb of deep cracks and fissures, but it had proved thick enough to stand against the bombardment. War didn't so much as slow. Hooves pounded against the road, the wall was upon them, and Ruin leapt. Twin trails of smoke marked his passage, sketching an impossible arc through the open air. The horseman, still standing, whipped Chaos Eater from his back. He spun it once, twice, and then leaned out over Ruin's head, the great black blade jutting forward like a lance. At the apex of Ruin's flight, the split-tongued tip of Chaos Eater seemed, almost gently, to kiss the already compromised wall. Stone exploded inward in a billowing cloud of dust and jagged shrapnel. Angels, alerted by the sounds from outside and standing ready in the center of a great lobby, recoiled with a chorus of cries as they were briefly blinded, their exposed flesh slashed and bruised. A few fell under larger slabs of wall, crushed by enough weight that they would not rise again soon, if ever. A couple of others were flattened by Ruin himself as he finally came down in the midst of the open chamber. Instantly he reared, hooves lashing out to crush cuirasses and helms, ribs and skulls. War laid about him to either side, wielding the massive Chaos Eater as though it were a toy. Limbs, blood, wings, and feathers clattered and splashed across the walls. Several of the angels opened up with their energy-spitting halberds, but between the clouds of dust and Ruin's constant rearing and prancing, few came anywhere near the target. Those that did were once again deflected by War's great armor. On occasion he would raise his left arm to shield his face from a particularly lucky shot, but otherwise he focused on killing. A second fusillade nearby clipped him from behind as the soldiers outside finally converged on the gaping hole in the building. At that same moment, from a balcony across the chamber, an angel took flight. This one carried not the small firearms War had faced so far, but one of the redemption cannons for which the White City's artillery divisions were so infamous. War snapped an order, and Ruin again broke into a charge across the lengthy hall. The first blast of the cannon slammed into the floor where they had stood just an instant earlier, leaving a smoking crater. Again Chaos Eater spun, once, twice, and War hurled the blade like a javelin. It should never have flown straight, not shaped and weighted as it was. But by now, none of the horseman's foes should have expected natural behavior from that awful blade. It sank through the angel's chest, spraying blood from front and back. With a cry that swiftly devolved into a wet, bubbling gurgle, the soldier plummeted. Carried by his galloping mount, the horseman passed beneath him as he fell. War rose up, snatching Chaos Eater from the wound, and the redemption cannon from the angel's fists, and was gone before the body hit the floor. "Stairs!" he barked, and Ruin obediently made for the broad and sweeping staircase against the far wall. War slung Chaos Eater across his back once more, and slapped the butt end of the cannon to his shoulder. Left hand on the pommel of his saddle, he slipped his right foot from the stirrups and spun. He hung, now, off Ruin's side, held fast by left foot and left hand, facing back the way they'd come. The redemption cannon roared again and again, and those angels who'd been entering through the shattered wall crumpled in smoking heaps. With a satisfied nod, War threw his leg back over the saddle, returning to his proper position, and transferring the cannon to its intended, and far less awkward, two-handed grip. The steps, sturdy but never intended to withstand this sort of physical and mystical abuse, splintered beneath Ruin's hooves. Horse and rider swept up and around, following the curve of the staircase. War pumped shot after shot from the cannon, either into the chamber below or toward the balcony above, wherever an enemy might appear. He wasn't killing all of them, certainly, but those he missed were apparently wise enough to take cover rather than try shooting back. The balcony opened up into a hallway with multiple rooms to either side. The rider knew, from the proximity of the doors to one another, that the chambers to either side were small, almost certainly not the laboratory itself or the home of the Sacrament Bomb. He put multiple cannon shots through each door as Ruin bolted past, just to be sure, but never once slowed the horse's headlong flight. It was not particularly defensible, this building. Large open rooms, straight corridors with no good choke points. Clearly Abaddon had repurposed an existing structure rather than building his own. And equally clearly he'd been relying on secrecy and the laws of the White City as his primary defenses. Perhaps that made sense, given how determined he'd been to keep the entire project covert, but... War sneered in contempt. The great general wouldn't be making that error again. As he neared the end of the passageway, he spotted a door at the far end, larger and, at least by appearance, sturdier than the others. And the angels very clearly did not want him passing through. Several soldiers leaned abruptly out of the last two doorways on either side of the hall, sending a barrage of halberd and cannon fire in War's direction. The horseman threw himself to the left, his grip on the reins and the saddle sufficient to topple Ruin along with him. The deadly bombardment whisked overhead, near enough to singe. War allowed the fall to throw him clear of the saddle and into the nearest of the empty rooms. He reached out and literally dragged his mount after him, barely wincing as the wall and floor around him shuddered with new impacts. Once inside the room, Ruin clambered to his feet and snorted indignantly. "I'll just permit them to shoot you next time, then, shall I?" The horse tilted his muzzle away, the very image of wounded dignity. "I thought not." A quick glance was enough to tell War that the room in which he'd sheltered was bare of anything even remotely useful. It had apparently been a study of some sort. The shots he'd pumped through the door as he passed had pretty well obliterated the desk, but the legs were still recognizable at the edges of a smoking hole in the floor. If he stepped out into the line of fire, his armor and his own innate resilience would probably allow him to survive whatever the angels threw his way, at least long enough to reach them. but he couldn't be certain that he'd be strong enough to continue the mission afterward. "I'd been hoping," he grumbled to Ruin, "to hold this in reserve for later, but—" Carefully he laid the cannon on the floor and drew his sword. He inhaled deeply. Once, twice, his skin began to tingle and burn with power. It was appropriately named, was Chaos Eater. The havoc and carnage of battle fed the weapon, and what strength it gained it passed to its wielder. War allowed that strength to settle in him, suffuse him, and then he called upon the magics that were his by right, as Nephilim and as a rider of the apocalypse. Crouched low, War bolted into the hall. He moved fast, incredibly so, his hair and cloak streaming out behind him, twin banners of war. Again the enemy opened fire, but for a few precious seconds the horseman is swift enough to weave through the fusillade. He dived forward into a roll, coming up in a crouch directly between the 4 occupied doorways. The angels within hesitated, holding their fire lest they overshoot their target and wind up striking one of their fellows instead. And that moment of hesitation was all War required. With a fearsome cry, he drove Chaos Eater point first into the floor, channeling a surge of magics through the blade. The hallway rippled for an instant, and then a forest of blades, each similar to Chaos Eater itself, burst from the floor in all directions. The steel thicket occupied several paces around the horseman, more than enough to catch the angels gathered in the nearby doorways. Only one died instantly, but the others suffered wounds grievous enough that they could do nothing but cry out as War approached. They did not suffer long. This close to the corridor's end, War could make out further details of the larger room before him. The door seemed sturdy enough, but nothing he and Ruin couldn't manage. A window near that door had been largely bricked over, but it was still sufficient for him to judge the thickness of the wall. Far less than the building's exterior, but sturdier than any other internal wall he'd seen thus far. As fiercely as the angels had fought to keep him from this room, War couldn't imagine it would be unguarded within. So, "Ready to go again?" he asked Ruin as he returned to fetch his mount and retrieve the redemption cannon. He could have sworn that his horse actually glared at him. He chuckled and leapt into the saddle. As soon as they were back in the hallway, War pointed at the far door. "Hit it low," he whispered. Ruin tossed his mane in acknowledgement. Again the great beast charged, and again War rose. Without the first hint of difficulty or imbalance, he slid his right foot from the stirrup and placed it upon the saddle, so that he rode in a one-legged crouch. Then, as the wall drew near, he jumped. Ruin dropped his front legs as he hit the door, smashing it open with his head rather than his hooves. As for War, a single blast of the cannon opened the wall above the door. The momentum of his leap carried him through as though he had an angel's wings himself. The guards within were, of course, ready and waiting for the intruder to come bursting through the door. When Ruin came in beneath their anticipated line of fire, however, and War above it, it took them an instant to reorient themselves. War's stolen cannon and Ruin's thrashing hooves denied them that instant. Half the guards were dead before the horseman's feet had touched the floor. A storm of vicious cuts with the fearsome black blade, a few blows that glanced harmlessly from War's armor, and the other half followed. War stepped over the fallen bodies, the rent armor, the limp wings, to study his prize. He found nothing. No superweapon of any sort, nor even any obvious components thereof. A few scratch-covered anvils and steel work tables encircled a central forge, but it looked as though few of them had been employed in recent memories. Only a single table showed any sign of use, and it held nothing but ammunition clips for redemption cannons and small arms. It would have been too easy, War supposed, to have found the main workshop in the first hallway of the second floor. The structure boasted scores of levels and literally miles of corridor. Then, why had the angels been so determined to keep him out of... "I'm a fool," he said gruffly, laying a hand on Ruin's neck. "We'll need to rethink our—" Horseman and horse cocked their heads as one, listening intently to the faint clatter of running footsteps. and heavy equipment moving about on the floor above. Clearly, they were going to have to fight hard for every step they advanced above this level, and with so much of the building remaining to search, the odds of success, even survival, appeared abysmally low. Despite his prior self-assessment, however, War was not such a fool as to fall for the same trick twice. The angels had fought so hard to keep him from this room precisely because it contained nothing of value, and the same was almost certainly true of the many floors above. They wanted him wasting time and effort, battling impossible odds in a game he could never win. Time, then, to change the game, he thought. His entire face seeming to burn the sudden inner light, War scooped up the ammunition clips and jammed them into his belt. He hefted the redemption cannon inelegantly with one arm, then knelt beside each of the fallen angels, collecting yet more of the clips. Ordering Ruin to follow behind, he strode out into the hallway, listening carefully until he felt he'd located the largest concentration of guards on the floor above. The cannon alone wasn't powerful enough for what he had in mind, but then he wasn't using the cannon alone. Standing some few paces back, he tossed one of the clips in a gentle arc, and, just as it hung in the air directly beneath the enemy, opened fire. From that point on, it was more a massacre than a battle. On each floor, War blasted through the ceiling above, taking the enemy by surprise, and, as often as not, killing a great many in the initial explosion. On occasion, the thick stone prevented him from hearing the footsteps on the next level, but Ruin's more sensitive ears never failed him. The building did not boast all that many guards. Still, had every angel in the building converged on him at once, they might have stood a chance. Most were determined to stand fast at their posts, however, so that was where they died. By the time War found what he sought, roughly 2/3 of the way through the building's many floors, the structure's outer walls contained as much debris as they did intact rooms and halls. War walked down a wobbling corridor, stepping over chunks of stone and chunks of angel, his armor scratched and smoking from those few shots he hadn't managed to avoid. Acrid smoke swirled in his wake, leaving trails of soot where it passed. The door, when he finally reached it, didn't stand out at all from any of the others. Indeed, the horseman very nearly passed it by until he noticed one tiny discrepancy. All the other doors were scarred and singed from the explosion that had obliterated whole swaths of the hallway. This one, other than a few ash-blacked blotches, was undamaged. A blast from the redemption cannon confirmed his initial assessment. The portal was definitely reinforced, perhaps mystically bolstered, to withstand attack. So much so, in fact, that it took 3 distinct blows from Chaos Eater before it split down the middle. War stepped through the jagged gap, cannon held, albeit awkwardly, in one fist, sword in the other. A peculiar hum, irritating as a mosquito trapped in the ear canal, permeated the room. War had no doubt that it came from the device that dominated the back half of the chamber. It was a sphere of brass, so large that it would have required a score of angels, stretched fingertip to fingertip, to surround the thing. It was not, however, of a single piece. Rather, the apparatus consisted of thousands upon thousands of tiny hexagons. These were not in any way sealed together, but simply hovered in their spherical configuration. At seemingly random intervals, a number of the hexagons would flip suddenly on one of their 3 axes. In that brief instant of rotation, War could catch the swiftest glimpse of the sphere's interior. It seemed full of an amorphous whiteness, less than a mist, more than a dream. Similar, but not quite identical, to the void stuff between realms. This, then, was the Sacrament Bomb. Standing between him and the weapon was a single angel, her face a mask of determination. She held a blade nearly the size of Chaos Eater in both hands, and her armor gleamed in the light. She was also the youngest angel War had ever seen, barely out of adolescence. "Does Abaddon employ children as sentinels now?" the horseman asked. Her features, if anything, grew harsher still. "I am not a child! I am Gauniel's finest student! And Gauniel is guarding the corridor." Her voice shook, despite her obvious efforts against it. "Ah, and he never expected you to actually see battle on this assignment, did he? That's why he stuck you here in the safest room." "Maybe, but I know my duty, and you will not pass while I live." War found himself smiling, though he struggled to hide it, for the sake of the young angel's pride more than anything else. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Uriel." "Well, Uriel, I've no interest in killing children, and you have to know you've no chance. Stand down and let me do what I must. Nobody will blame you." "I know my duty," she repeated stubbornly. "So be it." Uriel hurled herself across the room with a fearsome cry, wings propelling her like a living missile. War knocked her sword aside with Chaos Eater, then blasted it from her hand with a point-blank shot across the blade from the Redemption cannon. Uriel staggered, half-blinded and buffeted by the detonation. She was completely open, and War was never one to let an opportunity pass him by. Yet, at the last instant, he turned Chaos Eater on edge, so that it was the flat of the blade that cracked across Uriel's temple. She dropped in a heap, but she breathed still. War could almost hear the weapon wailing its disappointment. "You have spirit, girl. Given a few centuries of experience, I'd be honored to face you in real combat." As for his purpose in coming here, disposing of a weapon that harmed only demons while it sat in the middle of the White City, was simplicity itself. A few moments of study, and War located the hidden controls, a sequence of those spinning hexagons of slightly darker hue, each sporting a faint angelic glyph. No expert in the language of heaven, even War knew the numbers well enough. A bit of fiddling and poking, and finally they began flipping, one after the other in a very specific order. The flash, when it came, was blinding, clearly visible across the breadth of the White City. It was all the more disturbing for its utter silence, and for only the faintest rush of air, barely even felt. The Sacrament Bomb was gone, and so too were War and Ruin, having stepped once more through the membrane between worlds. The horseman's last thoughts, before he once more found himself in the void, were that he would do well to avoid heaven for some time, and that this, hopefully, was the last time one of creation's major factions would devote its attention to any sort of doomsday weapon. And that will about do it for Chapter 9. I have to say, I really like that this book is acknowledging, making reference to Darksiders 1 in addition to Darksiders 2. So we had a whole full scene with the Crowfather, yes. But Uriel was actually a major character in Darksiders 1 when she was considerably older. And yes, they did have that rematch. Also, the Redemption cannon itself wasn't just something they name-dropped a bunch of times. It was a usable weapon in Darksiders 1, dropped by, I guess, the angelic equivalent of heavy weapons guys. I seem to have a memory of using it during that competition with Ulthane to see who could kill more angels in a specific area. Good stuff. Very much enjoying this so far. Well, tune in next time for Chapter 10, when Death finally explains to the Charred Council what exactly the Abomination Vault is. And hey, we even get a brief appearance by Strife and Fury, who at this point in the franchise had never appeared in the game, so that's exciting. Alright, I'm BurningDogFace, and I will see you next time on Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault by Ari Marmel. Till then, have yourselves a great day. Later!